Hello, and welcome to Groundbreakers with Charles and Alice Dagit. Hi, I'm Alice. Groundbreakers is a show about the history of American architecture, and specifically, how it's been molded by the American dream, the American character, which simply bursts with ingenuity and invention. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings, and they shape us." Our culture and very way of life are embodied in our buildings. The way we live in houses and work in offices, the way we recreate, all are influenced by the buildings we use. Design informs everything we touch and experience. In this series, we will discover the ways in which architects and their designs have been molded by our culture, our economics, our environment, our social and political fabric. We will be going from place to place through an historical timeline to show how these influences indelibly shaped the architecture we have today. This is the American story of the innovation and architectural spirit that has created our architectural treasures. We hope that as you walk around your towns and cities, you will look up with renewed curiosity and ask, how come? Previously, we examined the staid plantation houses of Virginia, that state's capital, Williamsburg, and the neoclassical architecture of Thomas Jefferson. We contrasted them with the more quirky residents of Maryland, specifically in the busy seaport of Annapolis. Then in our last episode, we looked at how the Civil War dramatically fueled architectural innovation. We focused on two cities, our own Philadelphia and Boston, with their enormously groundbreaking architects Frank Furness and H. Richardson. These men rejected tradition and the federal style of architecture, and pioneered with their own very personal approaches. Each of them prospered in seaport towns, which fostered invention on so many levels. This week we visit another seaport town, Chicago. Yes, a seaport. Chicago too fostered invention prolifically. Here in the American heartland, true American modernism took shape, thanks to Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. We have with us award-winning architect Charles Dagit, who holds Pennsylvania's coveted Gold Medal of Distinction. A member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, Charles has won over 60 national, regional, and local design awards, and has written a fascinating book on this very subject. Welcome, Charlie. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what takes us to Chicago this week.
Well, it's interesting. The last episode we talked about Frank Furness and H. Richardson. In Frank Furness in Philadelphia and Richardson in Boston, both seaports. And what is interesting about Chicago is that Chicago, prior to the Civil War, in the early 1820s, had about 300 people. And by the 1890s, it was the second largest city in the country.
Oh my goodness.
And the staggering growth of Chicago came about because it ended up being a major trading center because a dead center in the country. And when the Erie Canal opened up, Philadelphia lost its seaport trading to New York.
Oh.
And New York then allowed for the shipping to go through the Erie Canal into the Great Lakes. Once they got into the Great Lakes, Chicago became the natural seaport for the Middle West.
Wow, who would know that?
And then, in order to help that along, Chicago fostered the construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal. And that canal linked the Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. And now the seaport trade could go all the way from Europe to the Caribbean through the United States.
This is amazing. I'm sure most Philadelphians wouldn't ever imagine Chicago being a seaport town.
That's right. Absolutely correct. And they then opened the Galena and Chicago Railroad in 1848, and that mushroomed it into becoming a huge major trading center. In 1856, they raised the entire city 3 feet through the use of hydraulic jacks.
Oh my goodness.
It sat on a moor, a marsh, and buildings were sinking and so on and so forth. So they jacked the whole city up 3 feet in order to shed the water from it and drain the marsh and make it into a real city. And
So that became stable land there, just
that
3
became
feet?
stable
Do
land,
the job.
and you can now build buildings on it
Wow.
reasonably, and you started to build high buildings. Now, the thing that also interested me and everyone else about Chicago was it too was the creator of an enormous number of inventions. The McCormick Reaper was invented in Chicago, and that harvested the world's food. And it became International Harvester Company, which is huge, obviously. And McCormick Place in Chicago is the convention center. And McCormick helped to foster the wealth of Chicago by enormous amounts. But the other thing that they invented was an invention that is extraordinarily American, and that is the catalog marketing company. Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward were the two leaders of the catalog marketing company. And what Sears Roebuck did, interestingly enough, is they created a catalog which was too large for your bookcase. So it had to sit on your table all the time.
Brilliant marketing.
Brilliant marketing. Now, what brings us to Louis Sullivan? Louis Sullivan was an architect who went to the École des Beaux-Arts, studied as Richardson did, and came back from his studies abroad to Philadelphia.
Oh, nice.
So that brings us back to Philadelphia and the Chicago link-up. Sullivan was in Philadelphia in the 1870s. Now, Philadelphia in the 1870s was incredibly wealthy because of the coal and the railroads, and it was also celebrating its centennial. Unfortunately, Frank Furness never got any of the work connected to the centennial.
Oh,
I don't know whatever happened to all his patrons, but they didn't get him in on the centennial, and so he never did any of the buildings there. And something else really tragic occurred that really hurt Philadelphia enormously was that Rockefeller decided to, he decided that the railroads were gypping him and charging him too much for
gouging him.
shipping kerosene.
Okay.
And the cities needed the kerosene for their street lamps. So Rockefeller decided to put pipe in the ground and pipe his kerosene, which led to the Panic of 1873
Oh, you're kidding.
because the railroads collapsed. And the railroads were the dot-com companies of the 1870s. And everybody owned stock in the railroad companies. And there were too many railroads, and it all collapsed.
Wow.
Philadelphia, being the home of railroading through the Pennsylvania Railroad, was economically really hit very hard. So Louis Sullivan is in Frank Furness's office.
He was working for
He was working for Frank Furness, and he looks around and says, there's nothing going on in this city. And Furness didn't have any work. Well, I think I'll just go out to Chicago. They had this fire.
I'll mosey on out there.
They probably need architects. So he arrives in Chicago, and Chicago is building its wealth through the McCormick Reaper and the catalog marketing companies. And what do catalog marketing companies need in order to process the orders? And that is clerical space.
Clerical space.
Yeah, you need all the clerks to fill out all the,
Oh, right.
take all the information.
That's right. You don't need
get
factories.
everything shipped.
Yeah.
So it takes an enormous amount of clerk activity in order to have a marketing, catalog marketing company.
Office workers.
Okay, so what happens in Chicago? Chicago starts to build office buildings because you need the clerks. And Sullivan just arrived at just the right time, and he came to Chicago, and he worked for William LeBaron Jennings, who people say is the inventor of the high-rise building. And then he formed his own firm, Denkmar and Adler, and he was commissioned to design an auditorium building.
Well, wait a second. Before you leave the office buildings, or maybe you're going back to them. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering what could support tall structures in what had been a horizontal city.
Well, I'm going to get to
okay.
that.
Okay.
So his first major commission is the auditorium building in Chicago, and Ferdinand Peck became his patron and decided that he wanted to build something that was equal to the halls of Europe for a opera house. And so he commissioned Sullivan, and Sullivan designs this incredibly elaborate theater, beautiful theater, and also embellishes it with a staircase very much in the Frank Furness tradition of the steel work and ironwork and so forth. And then he gets commissioned to design the Carson Peary Scott store, which is a retail store, not a catalog marketing store, but a major retail store in Chicago. And that building becomes a really great expression of the steel frame, which all of a sudden Sullivan comes to invent the steel frame building.
Oh.
Just the framework of the grid. And with the help of Carnegie Steel and the elevator,
Otis Elevator.
Otis Elevators in Chicago,
Oh.
he invents the first American high-rise steel office building.
So you had all of those different innovations coming together at one point in time. The elevator, the steel,
Yep.
the creativity of the architect.
And the catalog marketing
And the
company.
demand.
and
Demand.
the demand, all in one spot, creating the need for high-rise office buildings. And so he builds his first high-rise office building is the Wainwright Building in Chicago. And Louis Sullivan coined the frame, form follows function. And he was convinced that the high-rise office building should, in fact, take its clues from Greek classical architecture. And he proclaimed that an office building had to have a base, a middle, and a top. And so you see in his buildings a very strong base, the middle with all of the windows, and an elaborate cornice top.
So it's really
It's a column.
Yeah, exactly. It's a column.
It's a Greek column.
It can be as tall as it wants to be in the center as long
Exactly.
as it has a base and a capital.
So you see that in the Wainwright Building. You see it in the Bayard Condit Building, which is elaborately detailed at the top of the building. And Sullivan became enamored of terracotta, which is a clay product, which is fired in an oven like a brick. But you can create all sorts of artistic molds with it and imprint the mold of the design in the terracotta. And he used that to articulate all of the windowsills of the high-rise buildings. So you'd see a plate of terracotta at the windowsill in each of the floors.
And some of them were ornamental.
Very ornamental.
Ornamented.
Very ornamented. Towards the end of his career, he ended up, for some reason, losing the office building commissions, and possibly because office buildings were beginning to migrate to other U.S. cities, and New York was taking over. And so he ended up doing only small banks around the country in the later years of his life. The Guarantee Trust Building, he did a few houses, the Bradley House, and the Merchants National Bank. The Merchants National Bank has fabulous terracotta detailing and a huge arch that faces the street with a traditional lion in the facade. For some reason, the bankers really liked the idea of a lion protecting the money.
Sounds good to me.
So he had these elaborate terracotta lions on his bank buildings. As the Federal Savings and Loan Bank and the Merchants National Bank, they all had lions. And they had incredible detailed cornices and decorations on their facades, and that proclaimed them to be the bank.
So he was thinking a century ahead of himself and imagining a logo, perhaps. This is what I want banks to have on lions.
That could be true. In any event, it was rather extraordinary detailing that he elaborated on in the end of his life, and possibly got that through all of the fascination with the ironwork that Frank Furness was so intrigued by.
So you've mentioned, I'm glad you said ironwork again, because you've mentioned it a good deal, both this time and in our last segment, our last episode. And I believe, and if I'm accurate, I know our audience would love to know this, that Philadelphia was kind of the epicenter of ironwork.
That's true.
Ornamental ironwork.
Yellen was the iron.
Oh, Yellen, right.
Yeah.
And all that wonderful ornamental iron you see in New Orleans and other cities was all ordered from Philadelphia.
That all came from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Yep. That was the work of Philadelphia, and probably got its start through Frank Furness.
Oh.
Who began using
right, that's true. You said that.
The ornamental metal as part of his staircases and so on.
And then you said that Louis Sullivan had worked for Furness.
Yes.
So he would have taken that influence west with him when he went to Chicago.
Yeah, you can see it in the Carson Peary Scott front entry. Is elaborate metalwork, beautifully done, very sculptural, really extraordinary. Now that brings us to Frank Lloyd Wright.
I think a lot of people have heard of him.
Now, Frank Lloyd Wright worked for Sullivan. He did not have any formal training in architecture. As a matter of fact, he didn't even finish high school.
Frank Lloyd Wright?
Frank Lloyd Wright never finished high school.
Huh.
He took a few courses at the University of Wisconsin in drafting, and then he went to work for Sullivan. He worked for Sullivan for a few years.
So we have Furness in Philadelphia.
Furness,
I have to learn to say that right.
Sullivan, and then Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right. And a direct line.
And direct line of training. So he goes and works for Louis Sullivan. And he finds himself in the age, which is really an extraordinary age, in the early 1910s. We have, it is truly the time of innovation in this country, aside from all the other innovation times that we've had. But we have the automobile, the airplane, the telephone, the radio, the light bulb, and wireless communications, all in one decade.
That's amazing. That's true, too.
It is really, truly amazing. And he finds himself now designing buildings in this whole brand new age of communications and so on and so forth. His first building that he ever created was called, it was a windmill. And he built it, he designed it for his aunt and uncle. And it was called the Romeo and Juliet windmill because the plan looks like two figures embracing.
Romeo and Juliet.
Romeo, and it became nicknamed Romeo and Juliet. That was his first building. It's kind of a bizarre thing.
It was just a windmill? It was
just a windmill for the farm.
Okay, for a farm. Okay,
yep.
Okay.
One of his first buildings was his own home and studio. Now Sullivan ended up firing Frank Lloyd Wright because what Wright was doing, he built his own home and studio, was he was moonlighting on the side. And he never told Sullivan he was doing that. And so Sullivan let him go. And he then...
do you know at what point in his career, how old was he at that time?
I would say he was no more than in his 20s.
Okay.
Certainly.
Okay.
He then gains commissions for these various houses in Oak Park, right outside of Chicago.
Yeah, Oak Park is famous for it.
And you can go on tours and see the buildings out in Oak Park. They're really quite extraordinary. And he invents a style of house which is in complete revulsion against the Victorian. First of all, he declares that no house should have an attic or a basement. He just feels that it's wasted space. The people are throwing their money away. They shouldn't have them. And
So you didn't need a peaked roof.
you didn't need a peaked roof
Okay.
of a high peak.
Yeah, right.
So on.
Right.
And he starts to do buildings that are quite innovative, aside from his houses, and we'll get to the houses in a minute. He gets a commission to design, as Furness did, a commission for a Unitarian temple. And he designs that building all out of concrete.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of the first all concrete buildings in the country, in the world maybe. And Wright designed that building.
Did you say where that is?
It's in Chicago.
It's in Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, it has an interesting plan. It's a plan of a Greek cross, which is a cross with equal arms.
Right.
And so the whole focus of the congregation is to the center of the church rather than at the end of the church, as in traditional churches.
So it's theater in the round.
Now, this is long before Vatican II and any of those innovations. This is almost 100 years before.
Oh, so that was
It was really revolutionary,
revolutionary
as a place of worship, because you always focused it on the altar.
That's right.
He also designed a building called the Larkin Building, which was an office building, so it's no accident that he gets an office building coming out of Sullivan's office. But the Larkin Building is an interesting building because it forecasts the beginning of an open plan office of no walls. And it has a grand atrium in the middle of it, which is the first building with air conditioning. And the atrium lets the hot air go up and out
It's
the
almost-
space.
It's almost natural.
Almost natural air conditioning, but it did have air conditioning. It was one of the first with air conditioning in the building,
So,
which was very revolutionary at the time.
that is phenomenally revolutionary, and the open plan is almost 100 years ahead of itself too.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you look at the 21st century offices are open, and they hadn't been previously.
No,
Yeah.
that's right. So now we go back to his houses. He did several houses in Chicago, the Martin House, the Heath House, and the Roby House. And that was the innovation of what he called the Prairie School of Architecture, the Prairie House. And it was low slung with mostly horizontals. There's Sullivan doing all the vertical buildings, and Wright's doing all these horizontal buildings with low-pitched roofs and big overhangs for the shade.
So these are these all in Oak Park?
No, they're scattered around Chicago in various
Because
places.
I'm imagining, I've never been to Oak Park, which I regret. I'd like to see the residences there. But I'm imagining that horizontal requires a lot more real estate, a bigger plot than the more vertical houses previously.
Not really.
No?
But it's one of the things that's interesting about the houses is they begin to reflect Sullivan's interest in Japanese architecture. And the reason for that is that the Chicago, whatever it was,
Exposition?
the exhibition, the Chicago exhibition, was the first big showing of any Japanese garden architecture. And a number of architects visited that exhibition and saw that, and it began to, for the architects, began to link the architects to the land in their buildings.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what Sullivan does with the Prairie Houses.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright. He starts to link the land in with the building itself.
Okay, ergo, the title Prairie.
Prairie,
Okay.
right. So his fame begins to travel, and he ends up going out to California to do several houses out in California. One is the Ennis House, which is very innovative in terms of its use of concrete block, but concrete block with molded design, like almost like Sullivan's terracotta. He uses concrete block with patterns in it.
Well, then let me interrupt you if you don't mind. Is the fabrication similar to make terracotta and to make concrete block that's ornamented on one side? Is it similar the way they make those materials?
Well, it's cement versus
so
clay.
It can be
so it's not fired; it's poured.
Okay.
So it's not fired like a terracotta would be.
Is the terracotta poured as well?
Yeah, into a mold.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but one's fired and the other isn't.
Yeah. The concrete block is cured. It dries out and becomes hard.
Okay.
Like concrete.
Okay.
So he then starts using that material and creates patterns in the concrete block to use in the materials. And the houses are very odd. They, both of them look like early Mayan architecture. They're Mayan temples. They're very strange houses. I have to say that. And then he ultimately makes his most innovative house at Falling Water.
Some of us have heard of that.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania. And
back to Pennsylvania.
it was designed for a man who owned a very large retail business in Pittsburgh,
Okay.
like Wanamaker's or the Carson Peary family. And he was a man who sold suits and clothing and so on and so forth, department store. And he wanted to build a retreat for his workers.
Oh.
And so he hired Frank Lloyd Wright to design this house. And Frank Lloyd Wright designed Falling Water. It is said that Falling Water as a house is known throughout the world even more than the White House.
The White House in Washington. So when you said a while ago about overhangs,
That is the ultimate
image that
overhang.
came into my mind was Falling
Absolutely. And it's an extraordinary building. And it sits on top of a waterfall or hangs out over a waterfall. And it's an amazing building. When they were building the building, he had these cantilevers of concrete, and you have shores under the concrete when you pour it.
Explain what a shore
A
is.
shore is something that's holding the slab up while the concrete is cured.
So it's a kind of
and then you take it away,
temporary column.
and you still have the concrete. It's so petrified the builders that they wouldn't take the shores out, and Frank Lloyd Wright had to come and take the shores out. They were convinced it was all going to fall down. It was an incredibly innovative building. And finally, that takes us to his innovation in shape making and form. He gets the commission to design the Johnson's Wax building in New York. I'm sorry, the Guggenheim.
Oh, wait.
He does.
Johnson Wax was in...
He designed Johnson Wax building. That was another innovative building that is one of his only high-rise buildings.
And I can picture that, I guess, that lobby or that central space, because it has these almost mushroom-looking...
That's open plan office space for Johnson's Wax. And the whole building is made up of these columns with this enormous circular top to the column, and that forms the roof.
Oh.
And it holds up the glass that is in between the curved spaces.
Okay, so wait a second. Let's not rush through this, because so you have these columns that are structural, and they support the roof.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not aware of the glass that you're mentioning. Are you talking about the exterior glass?
The glass that glazes over the in-betweens of the circles, and that it's glazing that forms a roof.
Okay, okay.
And that brings the light into the office space where all the workers are working.
Approximately how tall is that building?
I say that the space is probably 25 feet tall.
Oh, okay. It's not 20 stories tall.
No, no, no.
Okay, thank you.
I should mention another building that he did, which is a famous building in which is Taliesin, which is where he had his studio later along in life after he moved from out. He had several different studios, one in Chicago, in Oak Park, one in Wisconsin, and then he did another one in Arizona.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have heard of Taliesin. Well, and Taliesin
He
West.
created a school there.
Oh, okay.
Well, that was Taliesin West.
Okay.
He created a school there, and people from all over the world would come and study under Frank Lloyd Wright's purview. But that goes back to his invention in form, and that's the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And Guggenheim is an incredible museum. Certainly suggest anybody to go there and see it. Lou Kahn, who was my teacher, did not like that museum because you can't get any more away from the artwork than the ramp will let you.
So
So-
for those who don't, again, I think a lot of people know Guggenheim, but for those who don't, explain the circulation, explain the theory behind the design.
Well, the Guggenheim, you enter the building and you go in an elevator and you go to the top of the building, and then you walk down a whole series of spiral ramps that take you down to the ground floor.
So
and that's where all the art is
So
displayed.
the museum is circular.
Yeah,
The exterior is circular.
exactly.
And you are required to view it's determined what art you see and in what order,
Yeah.
because you go this way all the
Yeah,
way down.
exactly.
And as you say, you can't stand back.
You can't back up any more than 5 feet away from a
Well,
painting.
no, it's got to be more than 5.
Oh, no, it's not much more than 5 feet.
Really?
Yep, yep. That brings us to his only office building that he designed, aside from the Johnson's Wax building, which was the Price Tower out in Arizona. And then, interestingly enough, he did a Unity Temple back in the early 1900s, and then he gets commissioned to do Beth Shalom out here in Jenkintown
Beth
area,
Shalom.
in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah.
And there he uses a whole glass roof for the creation of the interior of the synagogue. And it's an extraordinary building.
Yeah, that's a very dramatic space. I don't know whether it's open to the public or not. If it may be, I don't know.
I think I've been in it.
Well, a lot of people have been in it, but I don't know whether you need to go on a special day when it's open for some reason. But I would advise our audience to look into it to
Yeah.
see whether they can visit it or not, because it's
I
any-
should also mention, and I'm not showing it for this session, he also invented a type of a house which is a very inexpensive house. He marveled at the fact that he could design this house and build it, and included in it the price was the architect's fee for $5,000. And he did this in the 30s. And there are 4 houses called Usonian houses here in Ardmore, Pennsylvania.
well, first of all, they're meant to be low-cost housing.
Yes.
And yes, I've heard the term Usonian, and they were constructed elsewhere in the country, but we have 4 right here in
Yes,
Ardmore.
they were constructed in several different places in the country. And we have 4 of them here right in Ardmore, very close to us. They're unusual buildings, to say the least. One of the things that's interesting, Frank Lloyd Wright, myself, Le Corbusier, and Lou Kahn are all 5 feet 7.5. And his houses are no more than 6.5 feet from floor to ceiling. There was a fellow who lived in one of the Usonian houses. He was close to 7 feet tall, and I don't know how he didn't have a black head, because the ceilings are so low in those houses. It's quite amazing.
If you don't mind, I've been in one or more of those houses, very fortunately. And so for those in the audience who don't know them, I'm going to describe them. We're talking about 4 houses, so you might imagine 4 freestanding houses. No, they are 4 houses built kind of like a pinwheel. They are 4 quadrants of a square, and they fit together like puzzle pieces. I can't think of the puzzle. Is it Jenga? I don't know, some puzzle that people do now. And they are magnificent in the detailing.
Yep.
And the spirit of them. They just feel.
They're terrific houses.
I know. Very difficult to live in because they're teeny.
Yes, they're very small.
And I guess, again, he carried over the theory of no attic or basement, so it's very hard to have your stuff in them.
That's right.
But they are extraordinary, and I know that they're for private residences. I know that they're rarely open to anyone to come in and experience.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever see them listed in a local newspaper for a tour, the audience should absolutely take advantage of that opportunity.
Yep.
They are just magnificent.
So we're talking about tiny buildings, and the Usonian houses are, and one of his largest buildings is the Marin County Civic Center out in Marin County, north of San Francisco. And that is an absolutely huge building. So what happened to Wright is he ends up building buildings all over the country. And that's simply because of the airplane and the fact that we live in the age that we live in that allows him to be able to do that. So while Sullivan and Richardson and Furness did local buildings, Frank Lloyd Wright did buildings all around the country.
Okay, because he was practicing after 1903 when the airplane was.
And one of his
wait! Don't go so fast.
Yes, okay.
You're leaving me behind. About Marin. I think I have an image of it. I think people are looking at it on the screen.
It's a series of arches.
And it's very responsive to the site that it's laid out
yes.
on. It takes me back to the word prairie house. It seems to be very in unison with the land upon which it was being built. I assume that it didn't alter the land. It let the land alter it.
Yeah, Wright was one of the first American architects who actually really connected with the landscape with his architecture. And the Chicago Centennial certainly had a great influence on that, and so did the fact that he was commissioned to do the Imperial Hotel in
oh, yes.
Tokyo,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which has been destroyed, no longer exists, but is an extraordinary hotel. And he spent a lot of time in Japan, and he ended up absorbing a great deal of the sensitivity that the Japanese have of the land and their buildings, and how they connect them.
You can see that in his work. Yes.
You can see it in the work. And if you want to have an incredible trip, go to Kyoto and see the Japanese, the Shogun palaces and stuff, and the way that the buildings connect to the land are really
and the gardens.
And the gardens are extraordinary. And Wright was one of the first architects to begin to connect the land and the building together. Prior to that, we're looking at the houses and plantations and so forth, and the work of Furness and Richardson and so forth. These are all separate things from the landscape. They simply are placed on the landscape.
That's
and they don't really connect and interweave. Maybe the Furness Library of Penn is one of the first that actually takes the contour of the ground into effect, and then sort of engages you in the staircase that leads up to the front entrance. But those were rare in American architecture until Frank Lloyd Wright came around.
Yeah, that's true.
Although I must say that Jefferson was one of the most influential of the architects to begin to think about the land and the building. And that's what helps American architecture go beyond what the Europeans do, because our buildings connect to the land much more than many of the European buildings ever did.
That's interesting. Perhaps that has to do with, I'm just guessing here, that construction has been going on in Europe for millennia, and particularly, let's say, the last 1,000 years. And so therefore, people are building where something has already been built, whereas we Americans have only been building on this virgin continent for a couple of hundred years. So we have been, so an architect or a client has been gifted with this virgin land that hasn't been touched before. So they're looking directly at the land, whereas I assume in Europe, rarely do you get the opportunity to construct on something that hasn't already been altered.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I'm just guessing.
Well, I would say in Switzerland there's a fair amount of virgin land.
That's true.
The same thing for Japan. I mean, the interesting thing about Japan is that there is no space in Japan.
That's true.
And so they take their land very dearly, and the Swiss do too, as opposed to the French and the Germans and so forth. It's a curious aside, but it's true. But Wright certainly is one of the first architects to begin to connect the landscape and the building itself. Even with the prairie-style houses, they connect from the to the landscape. And I might say about those houses, Wright is the first inventor of the open plan. And what is interesting about the open plan is the use of very few doors.
Right.
Only in the very private spaces of the house are there doors, and the rest of the house is open. It's that, the, in quote, open plan.
Yeah.
So the dining room, the living room, all flow into each other. And that was an innovation that Wright gave us.
Yes, I don't know whether you alluded to this in our last interview, but something is making me remember that when Wright did residences, he decided that the hearth should be the center of the home, and the hearth was in the center of the building.
Yeah.
And all the spaces, God bless you, all the spaces revolved around or emanated from that center, as opposed to the hearth being, oh yeah, you were talking about chimneys in a previous.
Well, the Franklin stove.
Okay. Okay.
Benjamin Franklin was the first to invent a heating element in the middle of the space rather than on the periphery.
Right.
And he did that because the heat would flow out in all directions, and it would be very little wasted on the outside edges of the building.
Right.
Franklin invented that stove, and
So then Wright extrapolated.
Wright took from the stove the idea that the fireplace should be in the center of the house, not in the edges of the house.
And that's where he believed that people should want to hang out, the family should want to hang out near the stove, therefore in the center.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the more private spaces would radiate off of that center.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So that'll take us to the last building that I talk about, the V.C. Morris gift shop in San Francisco.
Oh.
And that was one of his last building projects that he did at the end of his life. He was a very prolific architect. He must have done probably more than 1,000 buildings.
Wow.
In his career.
Wow. Well, he started as a very young man.
He started as a very young man.
And lived all the way through the Guggenheim.
Right. It's one of the last buildings, and it's a very interesting building in that it's a gift shop with no street windows.
Oh.
And you have no clue what's inside the store until you get into the store. And the front facade is just one giant arch. And that's where you go into the store. And it essentially what it did was it intrigued people not to window shop. You had to go into the store in order to see what was in there to decide whether you wanted to buy anything.
Interesting.
And once they got you in the store, then you were caught.
Yeah.
And it was a prelude. Actually, it was I think it was done almost simultaneous to the Guggenheim Museum, because once again, you enter the store and you are taken by elevator up to a ramp, and then you ramp all the way down through the store like the Guggenheim.
Oh.
And that means you must see every trinket that's in the gift shop in order to get out of the gift shop.
Now that makes a lot of sense for a store.
It's a fabulous marketing ploy.
Akin to the tabloids that they put at the checkout at the grocery store.
They're very successful. It's still there now, and still a gift shop, and quite amazing design for a gift shop. And again, it's another innovation of Frank Lloyd Wright's inventions, which I would say he was one of the most inventive architects that ever came along certainly in America.
I'm sure people would agree because they've heard of him.
Yeah.
He's possibly the most well-known architect of the last few hundred years in the U.S. You would say Thomas Jefferson, perhaps, but Jefferson was so much more than an architect. Yeah, I mean, everyone knows Falling Water. Everyone knows Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
Most people know the Guggenheim.
Interesting, he was never asked to do a building in Europe. He did go over and do the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo.
Yes.
And I suspect he was asked to do that because the Japanese saw his architecture connecting to them through maybe the Chicago Centennial. The Centennial was the first time that the Americans were introduced to Japanese gardens at that Centennial.
Exposition.
They built the Japanese, as part of their pavilion, built a Japanese garden in the center of the exhibition.
Oh.
And people could tour it, and it was the first that Americans had seen anything of Japanese culture, and that was introduced in 1900 or so.
That makes some sense. I mean, it makes some sense that if a set of people were learning just tidbits about some other country, it would be more about their buildings, not their gardens, for heaven's sake. But there's no question that Japanese gardens are a thing unto themselves. They are.
And it introduced his work. Introduced a whole 2 or 3 generations of architects that have been influenced by that very connection of the land and the building in that way. And his ability to model the house in the landscape was really pretty extraordinary. He always felt that a building should end up modifying the landscape by improving it, not destroying it. And so he had an enormous amount of respect for the land and
That's beautiful.
and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he he felt very obligated to come away from a site with the land being made more beautiful than it was than before he touched it. Yeah, and that was kind of his model for life.
And he certainly could have learned that from the Japanese.
Yeah, and he could have learned it from the Japanese.
Yeah.
And certainly the falling water is the most dramatic effort of his in the landscape that you could ever imagine. I mean, there you really are living right in the landscape.
Right. You're part of it.
Yep, absolutely. And it's an extraordinary
just adding
building.
some horizontals to it.
I certainly recommend to whoever is in the audience that if you ever get a chance to get out to see it, to go see it. It's pretty amazing. It's now owned by the Pennsylvania, whatever the Conservancy. Yeah, and they maintain the building, and it's gone through a multi-million-dollar restoration in the last couple of years, and it was built for very little money.
Oh, really?
It was built all out of local snow. I mean, the notion of a LEED design building was so long before Frank Lloyd Wright. He used just the local stonework that was right on the site to build the house with. He used all the local materials.
So just as a quick aside, the audience might not know what a LEED design building is. It's, for one thing, it's spelled with 4 capital letters, L-E-E-D.
Yeah, that's true. That's all about sustainability, and that's a whole nother discussion.
We could do an hour on that.
Yeah.
But
anyway, but yeah, long before anybody ever talked about sustainable things, there was Frank Lloyd Wright doing his buildings.
Yeah.
So.
That's.
Anyway.
Yeah, and you brought up another topic. We keep doing this. We keep talking about things in this show that we hadn't intended to, and you mentioned Switzerland as well as Japan, and yes, both of those countries. It seems to me that they have so little buildable land. Switzerland is just so mountainous, and Japan is just so compact that that they really take great care, loving care, in the buildings that they erect on what little land they can build on.
Oh, yeah.
And that's part of what Wright has picked up from them as well.
Yep.
So let's see. We talked today about 2 outstanding architects, Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm not sure we contrasted them much. I guess we did. Sullivan was much more vertically oriented, as well as doing a lot of horizontal.
Well, Sullivan was an urban architect,
Okay.
and Wright is a suburban architect.
Okay.
He did very little buildings in cities. The Guggenheim is only one of, and the gift shop are one of the very few buildings that are in any city.
Okay.
So Sullivan is the city architect, and Wright is the architect out in the heartland.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the leap from Sullivan, whose work was more robust, I would call, to Frank Lloyd Wright, whose work is more lighter, more not ethereal, but there's a very big difference between the architecture of those 2 buildings.
Yep.
Though one was the master of the other, so to speak.
Yep.
The teacher of the other.
Yep. Yep.
Well, you know what we haven't talked about? We haven't talked about your book.
Well, this is the book, and it covers all the topics that we've discussed with this series, and we'll continue to do so.
Actually, yes, you did. You made me think about something. You were talking about buildings responding to the landscape with Wright, with the Marin County, and with everything that he designed. And it reminded me that upcoming in other chapters, other segments, other episodes that we do, there will certainly be other architects that we talk about that are very, very responsive to and influenced by the landscape that they're placing their buildings on.
Absolutely.
Especially as we get closer to modern day.
Yes.
Talk about quirky buildings as we get closer to modern day. So people should know that that book is not. It's called the Groundbreakers, Architects in American History, Their Places and Times. And to me, all of those words are important. Groundbreakers is certainly important because it only focuses on architects that have gone in a different direction than what had previously been done. But to me, the most important words there are their places and times, because you're really focusing on what molded the architect, what made the architect into the very different being that he was from who went before him.
Well, in describing the book, I oftentimes use the Louis Sullivan experience as really the core of the book. I mean, he goes to Chicago, he ends up with a town that needs clerical space, and he invents a building form to fit that economic need. And it's a perfect topic for the way I try to deal with all of the architects in the book, to talk about what their economic circumstances are, and the various influences that create the opportunity for him to leap to the front. So
yes,
that's what the book is all about.
Yeah.
And it's about each place around the country where really famous architects work.
And so it's, we've been talking a lot about innovation, but it's very much responsive to a synonym for that, which is invention. We're going from place to place in the country where different regions have blossomed at different points in time due to an invention that happened there, or due to economic circumstances that have propelled that region forward.
Yep.
Well, this has been extremely enjoyable, educational, mind expanding, as I think they all have been. So I should tell our audience to come back next time. Next time, we're going to explore the western edges of our continent and tell the story of fascinating California cities, Pasadena and San Francisco. You'll really enjoy watching the development of very different West Coast architecture. Join us then.